all readers of the New York Times know Jamelle Bouie is one of America's most cogent observers of the national scene. Uh, he's best known for his writing on issues of race and politics, to which he brings an acute understanding of how this country's history continues to reveal itself in the present. Jamel has had quite a career already for someone as young as he is. Prior to the New York Times, he had many stints. He was chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, staff writer at the Daily Beast, held fellowships at the American Prospect and the Nation magazine. We're just delighted to have him here with us this evening to hear from him. Moderating the conversation this evening is our own professor, Seth Maskett. Professor Maskett is professor of political science and here at the University of Denver, and the director of the Center on American Politics, which is based here at the Corbell School. He's one of the nation's leading scholars on political parties, state legislatures, campaigns, and elections. So please join me in welcoming Jamelle Bouie and Seth Maskett.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all for being here tonight. It's great to see such a turnout. Thank you to all who are watching and streaming this online. It's great to see you all, and I just want to thank Fritz for that really lovely introduction and for all his leadership on the Democracy Summit. Thanks to Lynn Clark and the Eslo Center for their support in putting this event together, and a special thank you to Megan Grogan for all your help in setting this up. Really appreciate it. My name is Seth Maskett. I'm a professor of political science. I'm also director of the Center on American Politics, based here in the Corbell School. And we're really honored to have with us tonight Jamelle Bouie of the New York Times. Fritz already had just a lovely introduction there. I'll just add a few quick points. If you've read any of Jamelle's recent work in the New York Times, you know he is deeply engaged in critical issues about American democracy, the extent to which the US Constitution itself is a democratic document, the role that slavery played in the nation's founding, the role that race and racism continue to play in the nation's governance, and the challenges parties face in picking leaders, for example, and more. Those of you who, like me, are more hardcore fans may listen to his podcast, Unclear and Present Danger, focusing on many great post-Cold War thriller films of the 1990s, or perhaps have read his various columns on ranking the breakfast cereals. But overall, Jamelle's work shows how the past reveals itself to the present, how policymakers, citizen activists, and cultural influencers can seize the power of information to make a difference. I'm going to ask Jamelle a series of questions, partially based on current events, partially based on conversations with some of you all, and we'll just go from there. So let's start with some current events. So this afternoon, Mike Johnson became the Speaker of the House of Representatives. If you'd have told me this was going to happen last night or even this morning, I probably would have said, who is Mike Johnson? But I would really just sort of generally love to know your thoughts on the past 22 days that the country has spent without a speaker and what we have learned from this unusual set of events.
First, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Denver. So
Welcome.
I wish I had more time to explore a little bit because it seems like a very lovely town. But I'm glad to be here. Okay, Mike Johnson. Mike, who? Yeah. So the one thing that I think is that actually makes this a little difficult to sort of analyze is that it's never happened before. Um, it's never been the case. Like there's been an impasse in choosing a speaker at the beginning of a session. We just witnessed that. That one was a little extreme, but it's not. That's the thing that's happened before. But first of all, the motion to vacate that led to Kevin McCarthy's removal is a thing that's never happened before in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives. Kevin McCarthy is the first speaker to be removed in that manner. The sort of farcical effort to choose a new speaker is also highly unusual. Never happened before, and so because it's so genuinely unprecedented, it's actually a little difficult to think like how like place this in a context, right? So like what actually is happening here. My best guess is that I think what we're witnessing, and it's a little tough to talk about like the political parties is monolithic in the sense that the Republican Party is both individual state parties and a national party and a congressional party and all these things. But at the very least, the congressional Republican Party appears to be kind of in a state of complete, uh, disarray. That there's no meaningful leadership within the congressional Republican Party. Perhaps this reflects kind of larger things within the national Republican Party, the extent to which there isn't any real leadership outside of the personality of Donald Trump, and it's actually difficult to describe that as leadership. He's just sort of like he's like a big old ape in the middle that people feel required to respond to in one way or another. Um, but I think that's what we're seeing. That like the congressional Republican Party, maybe the Republican Party overall, is just like extraordinarily fractured in a way that has made it difficult for it to settle on a leader. We were talking about this last night. There's a real sense in which the inability to choose a speaker kind of means that the House Republican majority doesn't exist. Like a majority should be able to elect the speaker. Majority cannot elect the speaker. Can you say that the majority really even exists? And if it does exist, to what extent can it actually act to do anything? Because there is the government has to be funded quite soon, and so can Speaker Mike Johnson? Um, uh, can Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana's 4th district, can he actually broker the kind of deals that would keep the government funded and do so in a way that enables him to retain the speakership? Like it's an open question. And so I think the main takeaway here is just that like the Republican Party in Congress has basically it's been over the course of a decade. I mean, you can go back to Gingrich, right? But at least this current situation, 2010 to 2012 to 2014, each successive cycle, you have a new set of lawmakers who aren't just conservative, but seem to be hostile to like governance and hostile to the things you have to do to just do anything, right? Like to any kind of compromise. Like I would hate to order a pizza with these people. I would hate I would hate to sort of like have to decide on appetizers because it seems like these are a group of people, at least a critical number of them, who it's like, hey, I like cheese pizza, you like pepperoni, maybe we get half cheese, half pepperoni. They would like flip over the table rather than have to not get all pepperoni. So that's right. That's my read of it at this moment.
Okay, that's good. I want to step back a little bit here and just sort of ask generally about your work at the Times over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years now. Your work at the New York Times, you have been on something of a mission to explore kind of the anti-democratic institutions and traditions that are part of the United States, part of the Constitution. I was hoping you could just, for the audience, can you describe this overall work? Can you summarize this? What are you finding regarding things like the Senate, the Electoral College, gerrymandering, the Supreme Court, and so forth?
Sure. So I have a long standing interest. There are like two periods of American history that like I really am seriously interested in. There is kind of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and kind of leading up to and after, and then there's the early Republic. And I spent a lot of time around the time I did my essay for the 1619 project, just reading a lot of history of the early republic and reading a lot about kind of the Constitutional Convention, about the Articles of Confederation, about kind of like the disputes and arguments that produced sort of this first phase of the American Republic. And one of my um, conceptual takeaways was to actually begin to think about American democracy and the Constitution as like separate things, right? That we tend to conflate them, that American democracy means the Constitution. But the Constitution, before it was the Constitution, was just sort of like, it was like a proposal. And many Americans, like enough that the ratification almost did not happen, thought that the Constitution was an imposition on democratic life as it had existed prior to it under the articles under the Continental Congresses, and that to me was like a really powerful insight or powerful observation because what it suggests to me is that there's like a what you call folk notion of what American democracy is. There's some notion of what American democracy is that is perhaps more expansive than what is contained and expressed through the Constitution. And when viewed in those terms, what the Constitution you may understand it as is an attempt to trim and restrict aspects of American democracy that its creators felt were less advantageous to their particular project. And they had like a particular project; they were trying to do particular things. Um, and so for me, like viewed in that context, the Constitution, as much as we equate it with U.S. democracy, as much as we think of it as like this democratic document, when viewed as being somewhat in tension with American democracy as it was understood in the moment, I think the clearly anti-democratic elements of it are much more visible and much more legible. And so there's the obvious ones like the Electoral College, which I won't go into it, but it's funny to me that when people defend the Electoral College today, they're like, "Oh, this was a genius, innovation of the framers." And then when you read the Madison's notes, at least, the very clear idea you get is that it's like late, and they're like, "We need to figure out something to elect a president with." And this seems like it might work. And even if it doesn't, George Washington's going to be president anyway, so who cares? And then as soon as there was like a competitive election, they were like, "Oh, this does not work. Um, this isn't working like we intended it to." So there's stuff like the Electoral College. There's stuff like the Supreme Court, obviously, counter majoritarian, you can say. But even things like the fact that we have a bicameral legislature, which we take for granted, it's sort of like, oh, that's just how you design a legislature, is a specific innovation meant to make the system a little less responsive to the public, and has its own set of like implications for like how democracy develops. The Senate obviously is like, even under at the time was understood as being unusually undemocratic relative to what came before. I think it's important to point these things out for a couple of reasons. The first is that we just experienced a couple years ago this attempted coup, this auto coup, whatever you want to call it, January 6th. And we often talked about it as like an imposition. But the actual plot of January 6th was very much like, how can we use the various counter majoritarian elements of the American system to overturn a presidential election? And if not for the fact that we have this sort of ingrained sense that the winner of the vote should become president, right? If you just take the words literally, then like, yeah, the state of Arizona, the legislature, had it had the wherewithal, maybe could have thrown out the votes, and that would have been perfectly constitutional, right? The legislature is now going to assign electoral votes to the person it thinks should have them. And when you begin to like look at how the system is structured in the Jan 6 plot, to me, it's like, oh, that plot uh, is weaponizing actually elements of the Constitution. It's like it's anti-constitutional in the sense that it's sort of a violation of like the general agreement of what we think constitutional government is. But like in terms of the literal text of the document, nothing in the rule book says you can't do it. Nothing in the rule book says a dog can't play basketball. Nothing in the rule book says you can't. Yeah. I'm a millennial. Nothing in the rule book says you can't overturn an election in that way, absent sort of you know uh, political will not to do that. There's political opposition to it, but the rules they're a little shaky.
So this basic idea, this that the Constitution and democracy should be thought of as distinct things. I mean, this seems like a really important and potentially very controversial observation. I'm just curious, when you make these arguments, how is this received by your readers, by your editors? What kind of pushback do you get, and frankly, how do you deal with it?
Well, with editors, so the thing about being a New York Times columnist, and you may have noticed this reading the columnists if you read them, is that we we have editors and we work with the editors, but there's no process really in which I say I want to write this and someone says no. Like that doesn't really happen. So we can kind of I can kind of make whatever argument I want. If it doesn't seem like it's sound, my editor might say, I don't think that's a particularly good argument. But within sort of like the bounds of being responsible with the platform, you can kind of say whatever you want. And so I'm not. It's not. There's not really pushback from my editor at all. But readers, I find readers. I'll back up. Part of how I write when I make these kinds of arguments is I try to walk a reader basically through the logic, and this is where kind of thinking seriously about American history really helps. Um, because what I maybe the thing I want to impress upon a reader is that listen, this particular element of the system that is, that I think is like it is counter majoritarian. I think it's anti-democratic. I think we'd be better off changing it. It was controversial at the time it was created. It was not singular genius. It was a political thing that was argued over and debated like any political thing. And so walking a reader through the arguments for and against and why the arguments for may have prevailed over those against. And then um, sort of me kind of entering and saying, are the things that led to the creation of this actually still relevant for us in the present? Maybe we should begin to rethink what we need out of this, given that the whole idea is this is a system of self-government. So like in structuring an argument like this, I am kind of trying to disarm readers a little bit and to not immediately have them go, "Oh, this is too out there. I don't want to engage with it." Like having the characters of the piece be like founding fathers or like people from this era, talking about them in ways that are, not negative, just sort of like talking about them as like political figures, in some ways admirable, in some ways not, and kind of appealing to a reader's sense of curiosity and to a reader's own, their own maybe set of commitments to the American system, and trying to just sort of cultivate the idea that not only are things not set in stone, but what we think of as being inherent or integral to the system may not actually be so. Um, that can get readers to, in my experience, sort of like at least be open to the argument. Some are still like, this is stupid and you shouldn't write it. But I think most of my readers, as far as I can tell, from responses I get, email and the like, most of them at least like take seriously uh, that I'm not trying to be inflammatory and not trying to sort of like these are not hot takes. I'm actually trying to like make an argument about the structure of American politics and kind of invite them to think about it along with me. I think most readers take that seriously.
That's nice. Okay. Um, so, talking about some of your other work here, as you've pointed out in your work, the American project has long been focused on building a functional multiracial democracy. And yet, a lot of the structure of the Constitution, a lot of the history of our democracy and our party system have been built to limit racial inclusion. And I'm curious, how do we think about this? How do we synthesize this? And is it possible to build such a multiracial democracy with these kind of constraints?
I mean, I think it is. It would be bad if I didn't. Mm. No, I think it's. I think that is. I mean, that is sort of the experiment such that it's been since the 1960s, right? Sort of we the United States has always been this big, diverse, sort of at least quasi democratic state, right? Like even if I think that currently it's like a little more than a third non-white, according to the census. Even if you're not taking the mean in those terms, you know, Americans in 1900 would have seen this burgeoning population of Italian and Russian, and other Eastern European immigrants, and been like, yeah, this is like we're a multiracial country, right? Like they were not. This was not. These are not understood to be a bunch of white people, just like a bunch of ethnics of various stripes. We've always been this big, diverse country, but it's only been the last 60 years or so that we have made this actual effort towards full political inclusion of everyone, of every citizen within the borders of the United States. Not everyone in the United States, right? Residents of Puerto Rico, of Guam, of U.S. Virgin Islands, undocumented immigrants, like they do not enjoy full political inclusion. But along the boundaries of citizenship, this is like the first time we've tried to say everyone who is an American citizen, for the most part, we're going to try to include them in and extend to them political equality. And so I think my view is that if that is our aim, and I think it should be, then at least on the political question, we should look at the way that our institutions like make this more difficult than it is. The way our institutions may actually end up privileging some groups of voters over others for entirely arbitrary reasons. And we should want to try to change that for the sake of this goal of like political equality across the society. Now, I tend to think that this is in some way kind of like the easy question, right? Like it's I think you can actually get a lot of people to sign on to the idea that everyone who currently is an American citizen ought to count equally. Most Americans are opposed to the electoral college. Right? They think we should have a popular vote. I think that if you, I think you would probably find more people than you think might be a little shaky about whether the Senate should exist in the current form it does. I think on those big institutional questions that directly touch political equality, you could probably find a lot of consensus among Americans. But the difficult question is there are groups of people within the polity that do not have full political rights. I live in Virginia, where incarcerated people, former felons, do not get automatic restoration of rights. The governor has to sign off on it. And so, if the governor does not sign off on your rights restoration, when you leave prison after you serve your time, you are disenfranchised. So that's one category of people. I would say, I mean, this is maybe one of my more kind of like out there positions that I'm not sure that there's really strong grounding for the idea that incarcerated people are forfeit political rights. I'm not sure that we should do that. Reasonable people disagree. Most people disagree, but that's where I stand. Um, there are localities that have experimented with extending voting rights to undocumented immigrants. I uh, I understand why we do not do that in federal elections, but I would at least ask that you think about and try to think through the rationale and reasoning for doing that. Even if you think it's the right thing to do, it's still useful to go through the exercise of thinking about why we don't extend political participation to those people. And then there's like America's colonies, is the best way to put them, like Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, these places where the people there are American citizens, right? Like if you go from Puerto Rico to the US, like you don't have to have a passport. And yet they don't have representation, voting representation, and don't really have full political equality under the American flag. And so those are the hard cases. Like what is actually our orientation towards those groups of people? Should we include them fully? I think we should. And you know, should do we need to change actually the structure of the US system to accommodate a larger polity, right? Like, is that a thing that we need to take seriously and consider? And I think with my column, it's sort of like I don't know how much whatever influence or not I have. The most I feel like I can do is ask readers to sort of like take this stuff seriously. Do not take it for granted. Like I said just a minute ago, even if you agree with the exclusion of one group or another, it's worth to yourself walking through the logic and the reasoning. Because maybe if you begin to walk through the logic and the reasoning, you find that you don't necessarily agree with the logic and the reasoning. And that's an important realization for yourself as well.
Thank you. So, a question about journalism, actually. One of the challenges in political journalism and political science, honestly, is that functionally the head of the Republican Party and the leading candidate for its presidential nomination is facing 91 criminal indictments, many stemming from efforts to overturn a presidential election, and also regularly threatening democratic processes. I'm curious, what is the right way for the media to be dealing with this? What is the right way for the media to be covering him? Or other candidates who have expressed hostility to democratic traditions. Are we covering him in the right way? Should we be doing something different?
As a guy who's like in the opinion section, I can say whatever I want. I can cover him and be like, yeah, this guy sucks. You shouldn't. He's bad. Um, uh, I think it's a genuinely difficult question for people doing straight news for the newsroom, um, because first, kind of even if you have some larger commitment to preserving democracy in like a broad sense, day to day, your job is to like fairly report the news. And although I think reporters can sometimes say, I'm not what you worried about public perception, what the public perceives does sort of matter. Like it would be fair and straightforward and objective, right? When you covering Trump, to make notice in every story, like near the top, right? To say Donald Trump, Republican nominee, also facing 91 indictments, like also, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are relevant facts to know about this public figure. But the accumulated effect of making that note is very much to be like, yeah, this guy shouldn't be president. That's the message that sends, and readers will pick up on that. That's not something you're not going to miss. And so, from the perspective of the journalist, it's like, well, if I do that, do I all of a sudden begin to seem as if I'm not giving a fair hearing to this guy or to his supporters? And I want to be seen as giving a fair hearing because A, I want those readers, but B, I want them to trust the reporting. I want them to trust I'm not trying to pull one on them, but I'm really being as fair and judicious as I can be. And so I think there is a kind of built in to sort of like the pressures of journalism, especially as a for profit enterprise, it's hard to just be straightforward. In a funny way, it's hard to be objective because being objectively, the guy shouldn't be president. I mean, I don't know. I don't. Can I say? I can. This isn't about as political. Objectively, I just feel like if you're catching multiple charges from the feds, you shouldn't be president. This seems straightforward to me. You can just Republican voters can just choose someone else, not catching multiple charges from the feds. You can like do that. Uh, so okay, let's see. I can't object. Okay, so anyway, journalists can't say that, and it's hard not to write about him, noting his criminality in a way that doesn't create the impression that you're slanted against him. And so I think it's sort of a tough spot to be in. I think the likely response is just to sort of like try to bring as much scrutiny to his opponent, his like most likely opponent, President Joe Biden. But even then, that can create sort of like a skewed perspective, right? Like if it actually isn't the case that whatever difficulties and scandals whatever facing Biden are not on the same level as those facing Trump, giving equal attention to them is not really fair. So I don't know. I think that I have a lot of sympathy for my colleagues in the newsroom who I think are kind of in a tough place with regards to how they're going to report on this election. I think a lot of readers are going to be very upset about whatever choices they end up making because there's sort of not a lot of good ones. There's not a lot of great coverage choices to make when being as fair minded as you could be about one of the candidates at least strongly creates the impression that that guy shouldn't be a candidate, and that's like not what you want to do. You simply want to report the news. You don't want to create the sense that sort of like you're against this guy, but kind of inherently, if you are saying each time, by the way, 91 indictments, then readers are going to very quickly get the impression that sort of like, oh, they don't want this person here, which might be the case with the individual journalists. I don't know, but it's a tough thing for doing coverage.
When I mean, we assume they know that at this point, right?
Yeah.
Too? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's like it's not news. I mean, it's new. It's news in the sense that it's never really happened before, right? Like we've never really had a a major party nominee or likely nominee who is this like exposed to to criminality, into criminal prosecution. Um, so in a sense, it's like everyone knows it, but it's still noteworthy. I don't know. It's tough.
So, related question, more about just sort of guardrails. Um, Yesterday in Washington, if you're Washington, if you're watching the news, Tom Emmer was the Republican House Speaker designate for 5 minutes. I don't know,
Like
an
four
hour, couple
hours,
okay.
about the length of the new Scorsese
Yeah.
picture.
Ouch. Okay.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
that wasn't an
Literally,
insult. This was
yeah.
sort of like literally. That's
Yeah, but not as long as the last one he did. But yeah.
Mhm.
One of the things that hurt Emmer and his party was that he had voted to certify President Biden's election in 2020. And, that seems to be, that's like a litmus test now. So even when Democratic threats are not at the top of the agenda, they're still very much there. They're still very present. Um, so in early 2020, on this very stage, for those of you who were here, Mitt Romney was here. Senator Mitt Romney spoke about Democratic threats. He had literally flown here directly from D.C., where he just cast a vote to convict Donald Trump in his first impeachment. You wrote a bit about Mitt Romney and his recent decision to retire and some of the his actions. I was curious the extent you thought that he presents a model,
Yeah.
a model for Republicans, for others in preserving and protecting American democracy. That is a conservative Republican willing to work with his party on many issues, but depart when democracy is threatened. Is this a functional model? Why do more people not follow it?
I mean, I think it's a functional model. Like I disagree with Mitt Romney on probably most things, but I think that when he during the impeachment trials, taking very seriously his sort of role in that trial, taking very seriously the evidence against him, trying to separate himself a bit from his partisan attachments to make a judgment. I think it's a thing that is possible for others in the Republican Party to do. I think that the difficulty, like the issue for Republicans, which in this new book, it just came out, this new book by McKay Coppins on Romney, and if you don't know the story of the book, Coppins has been covering Romney for a long time, and Romney, kind of ahead of a retirement, gave McKay basically access to sort of all of his papers, which is extraordinary. You don't usually get this much access to a politician until like long after they're dead. But Romney basically sort of giving McKay literally the keys and saying, you can use whatever you want that I've out of all these papers, letters, diaries, everything. And there's this book that's sort of a story of Romney, the story of Romney. And Romney in the book, in the excerpts we've gotten from the book, is like very critical of fellow Republicans, is sort of dismayed at the extent to which they've shown no backbone. He notes that the same people who will criticize quite cogently and intelligently Trump behind closed doors will be utter supplicants to him in public. And to me, that's a sign that it's not so much that there's obviously there's an absence of will and backbone among a lot of Republican office holders, but there's also a lot of just bad incentives and things that sort of like are actively pressuring anyone away from taking a more critical perspective to Trump within the party. Some of those are obvious, right? Like Romney has spoken about death threats his family's gotten in the speaker business. Like, Republicans opposed to Jim Jordan were like, yeah, we were getting death threats for opposing Jim Jordan. So there's obviously this threat of violence that is part of at least like some portion of conservative politics that is like shaping shaping the decisions of office holders. There is conservative media, which acts in this sort of like has like this disciplining function for the Republican Party. If you don't toe the right line, then you might turn on, then in 2020 would have been, or 2021, you would turn on the TV and Tucker Carlson is railing against you at the prime time on the prime time slot. Sean Hannity is railing against you. Like there's a whole phalanx of people with quite large followings who will make you like the object of today's 2 minutes hate if you are not towing the line the way you should be. And so Republican office holders are responding to that. They just don't want to get in the way. Republican voters, at least some portion of the Republican base, has no appetite. Well, first is devoted to Trump, has no appetite for compromise, has no appetite for the give and take of governing, and will actively punish lawmakers who engage in that. Although there's a way in which this is sort of in a relationship with media as well. Like, how much is this preference the product of conservative media inculcating this preference into voters? It's a loop. Um, and yeah, you basically have like all these fears and pressures that are strongly pushing Republican office holders to not behave like Romney, and also selecting for people who will not behave like Romney. So you have folks who might be sensible behind closed doors, but are just like, I don't want to deal with the grief, and so I'm not. And then you have like the Matt Gateses, right? Sort of like a process of actively selecting for these kinds of people to be in office. And so it's like Romney is like, you can there's Romney is a model, right? Yeah, he's a committed conservative Republican who's also a committed believer in the Constitution. And there's no you can do that. There's nothing to stop one from doing that, other than all of these like malincentives within the Republican Party. I feel like or rather I think that the most striking example of this was just like the immediate aftermath of January 6th, where there was any moment for the institutional Republican Party to just like cut ties with Trump. It was that, right? Like, half these guys were literally in fear for their lives. um you know they were shaken up, they were frightened, and at least my recollection is that in that moment some of them might have voted to like, if you had the impeachment and removal vote on January 7th, I think there's a pretty good chance Trump may have gotten removed from office right then and there. But as soon as there was any time allowed to elapse between the moment and the potential political consequence, it's like all those mechanisms of preventing Republican office holders from like bucking Trump began to kick in. And in pretty short order, you have, well, impeachment's not appropriate, to, oh, well, this isn't actually that big of a deal, to actually the insurrection was good, to actually, our main aim should be to, restore Trump as rightful God Emperor of the United States, right? Like that's the progression, um, uh, for a lot of Republican politicians. And so it's sort of like, I don't, I myself am not sure what one does in this moment, because you can't say, you can try as much as you can to encourage Republicans to like be Romney, but then they look at Romney and he's like a pariah among Republicans. Liz Cheney, right? Like Liz Cheney, who is an arch conservative, the daughter of Dick Cheney, is a pariah. Um, you know, if you have any hope of a career in Republican politics, well, why would you do that? And then it's also not realistic to say, well, I guess Democrats just have to like win every election. Well, no, that's not going to happen. Eventually, you know, Republicans will be back in, and you would prefer Republicans to be in who didn't think that it was okay to subvert uh, the electoral process. But I'm not really sure what we do about that.
You brought up the issue of political violence. This actually came up in an earlier discussion today. I wanted just to ask you a little bit more on that, because some of the coverage on January 6th was, look at this violence. This doesn't happen in America. Well, we know that's not true. But is this an unusually violent era? Or, I think you'd pointed out like the 19th century was rife with all sorts of political violence, and we've had earlier eras of this. How should we be thinking about this era compared to earlier ones?
Yeah, I do not think that this era is especially violent politically. There's still political violence. It's still bad. This isn't to condone or say that it's okay, but to note that even something as dramatic as January 6th, in a lot of ways, is like the exception that proves the rule. That, and I mean, it's quite an exception, but nonetheless, previous periods of U.S. history, even the 20th century, were just like much more violent. Like there has not been, right, in a at least I cannot think of a assassination of a major political figure in the United States in quite some time. In the 60s and 70s, we obviously had like a lot of them. there, there is presidential assassination, assassinations of major political figures, attempted assassinations of major political figures. Like it was like a recurring thing. And then as you go back in time, American politics becomes like more and more violent. So yeah, I don't think this is a particularly violent time in American political history. I do think that there is, perhaps because I think maybe we feel that we've gotten past the violence in American political history, that this feels especially fraught. I do think that there is a sense that there's such intense polarization in the country that even like a r- historically modest level of political violence seems like it's explosive in a way that it might not have been in the past. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I have any like conclusions to draw. Right, it's just sort of like it's an observation. Like things aren't really that violent. The violence we do have is quite scary and disturbing. It's not unprecedented, right? There have been like attempted violent overthrows of state and local governments in American history, at least two of them successful. Um, there are lessons to take from those events, mainly that it's really important to hold the political perpetrators accountable, because if you don't, they will 100% try again. And I am afraid that we haven't necessarily learned that lesson. Here's okay. Here I'm coming to I'm synthesizing the position right as we speak. It's coming to me. Um, the I think the problem of sort of like the idea that political violence is exceptional in the United States is precisely that it leads us to not want to hold the perpetrators accountable, right? The political perpetrators, maybe the people who stormed the thing, yeah, the FBI is going after them, but at least the politicians and such, we say this was a strange anomaly, this was a one-off, this was exceptional. We stopped it; it's not going to happen again because things like that just don't happen here. um, and a sort of refusal to grapple with the fact that things like this have happened here at some points in our history. They've been like relatively common, and they can happen again. There's nothing about being the United States that makes us immune to these things. Can lead um, I think can lead observers, can lead ordinary people, can lead policymakers and lawmakers to sort of be like, well, we don't got to worry about it. We don't have to take any extraordinary measures to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's sort of a version of during the Trump years. There's lots of talk about like guardrails in American politics. So the guardrails are failing, as if the guardrails just like work on their own, right? As if they don't require actual people to do something. And I think that there's a sense that because the US has been so seemingly stable over such a long period of time, there's a sense that there's not really all that much we have to do to maintain the machine. But then when you recognize that like periods of stability can obscure really serious upheaval and violence, in that what we think of as what we might think of as being normal politics, when you scratch a little, what you see in fact are consequences of unaddressed violence and unaddressed attacks on democratic life that really do like have significant and severe effects on Americans, which weren't inevitable, right? Like Jim Crow wasn't inevitable. It wasn't preordained to happen. It happened in part because simply was not the political will to protect uh free and freed African Americans in the South. And so without the political will to do it, it was effectively open season on this category of Americans. So and so that happens, and then us from the present, we look back and we say, oh well, that's just how history unfolded. That's just how the story went. But in fact, there was like an Earth 2, right, where it doesn't happen that way. There's an Earth 3 where maybe some of it happens and maybe some of it isn't nearly as severe. Like it's all very contingent. And so the idea that not addressing crises when they hit, not addressing the problems or the instigators of political violence in the moment, the idea that we can not do that and then not suffer any consequences, to me seems like ahistorical and just like unwise and foolhardy. And I unfortunately, I think we may next year is going to be a test case, right? Like the former president not being held meaningfully accountable in political life means that sort of he's free to run again. Insurrection or a commitment to January 6th and those events is like orthodoxy among the new Speaker of the House. And so it's like this is if there's a consensus position in the Republican Party, that's it. And we may think of it as being inevitable, but like it wasn't. It was a product of like this has happened because of choices made by political actors a couple years ago. And what happens in the future, you'll be able to draw a direct line from those choices to that as well.
So I'd like to ask you a question about populism, which is, I know, a subject you've written somewhat about, subject I'm currently trying to research and understand. We've had a sort of a strain of I guess you'd call it conservative populism. Over the last several decades in this country, it's becoming increasingly powerful, arguably increasingly illiberal. But this is not the only version of populism that exists in the world, right? We've seen sort of left populism in other countries, sometimes at different points in our own country's history. I'm just sort of curious how you interpret what's going on, how you interpret that ideology.
Yeah. So I'm not sure it's an ideology. I think is my initial thought. Like I'm not sure if it's an ideology or just like a rhetorical posture, right? Like President Trump's rhetorical posture is like, I embody the people, I embody the legitimate people of the nation. That's like a classic kind of populist appeal. The legitimate people of the nation are under assault from perfidious elites from above, the globalists, but also, parasitic dependents from below, the refugees and the immigrants and such. And I'm here defending the great, broad, legitimate middle of American politics. Like very, very classic right wing American populist appeal. But then when you drill down to like policy, it's like, well, what does this mean in practice? It means sort of like, okay, tax cuts, immigration restriction, you know, doing as much as possible to like slash the social insurance state. So it's just like standard issue conservative politics, which is with a different kind of rhetorical posture. Now, I think where things get fuzzy is that rhetorical posture, because it is like quite illiberal, can sort of if you believe you embody the legitimate people of the nation, then what right does a Congress have, does the legislature have to put limits on your authority? And that's where things get sort of like, oh, that's where the populist rhetorical appeal bleeds into sort of like an actual, kind of ideology. Um, but, you know, you could make those kind of claims without the populist rhetorical appeal too. So that's all to say that I myself am not sure how we should think of populism, the contemporary political movement, as like a distinct ideology or just like a rhetorical appeal in political style that can be utilized by a variety of different kinds of figures on the right. And there's there on for left populism, there's some of this as well. Like the targets are different. It's sort of like, we represent or I represent the legitimate people of the nation against sort of like, corporations, against a variety of enemies, top and bottom. But even it doesn't have the same. It's sort of like this is getting to why I don't like the word that much, because it's sort of like, okay, left populism, but the claim of the Bernie Sanders campaign wasn't "I alone can fix it. I alone am like your herald." It was collectively we can stick it to the corporations. Right? Like collectively we can pursue our if we can strip away the corruption, if we can purify American politics, then we can collectively achieve the things that we would like to achieve because we all kind of agree with them. That really is a different kind of rhetorical appeal than what you're seeing from Trump. And so we call them both populism, but I'm not sure that we should. I'm not sure how useful that word is. I'm the kind of crazy person who's like, we should only use populist to talk about the Farmers Alliance of the 1880s and 1890s. Um, uh, but no one else agrees with me about that. So but yeah, I guess that's my answer. I'm not certain to what extent we should think about it as like a coherent ideology. And at least when it comes to right populism, there are there are elements of it that can like can fit very well in sort of like a democratic politics, and there are elements of it that cannot. Um, and sort of I think kind of the question, if there's going to be if there is a post Trump era, right? Like if next year Joe Biden gets reelected and Trump doesn't go to jail, but he decides I don't want to do this anymore, and then the Republican Party has to figure out what it is. I'm sure if maybe the anti-democratic stuff proceeds from a bit, there'll be attempts to sort of incorporate a kind of like elements of Trump style right populism into like a more kind of mainstream democratic, lowercase d democratic politics, um, and leave the kind of like the implications of illiberalism behind. Because I think that's possible, but um, even that still seems like mostly rhetorical to me. Like I don't know. It doesn't seem like there's any ideological content there, which maybe is what makes it a little powerful, right? The fact that there isn't any ideological content, that for Trump especially, you can project essentially a lot of what you want onto the guy. Um, that's what makes him especially politically potent. That like, yeah, there is nothing there. It is just rhetorical appeals, and that's all you need.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on that one. That's an interesting one. I want to ask you a film question
Okay.
because I know you know movies. Um, I obviously want to know what you think is a key film to watch to understand this moment in American politics. Now, I have some students out here. They'll tell you that I'm a go-to for Scorsese's Gangs of New York, which is all about what happens when the state is not seen as like a neutral third-party arbiter and set amidst the draft riots of the Civil War. Do you have sort of a favorite for understanding U.S. politics today?
That's a great question. I'll say about Gangs of New York. So there, there are actors. Someone's made this joke before. I'm stealing it. There are actors whose faces look like they've seen iPhones and shouldn't be in period pieces. And at least the young Cameron Diaz and young Leonardo DiCaprio do not look like they existed in 1840s New York City. It's the one thing about that movie just that takes me completely out of it, because it's like you have Daniel Day Lewis who looks like he may have actually like butchered a bunch of Irish immigrants at the polls. Um, uh, uh, and then it's like Leo DiCaprio. It's like, what are you doing here, man? Brendan Gleeson like looks like a guy who belongs. Uh, Cameron Diaz does not. Anyway, that's not the question you asked. But this is my problem with Gangs in New York. Like, if you made a movie just about Tammany Hall, I would be like, I would buy 20 tickets. I'd love it. But that movie, because it's the Leo Cameron Diaz thing as well, it's sort of like, I don't know if they belong here. Okay. Movie that can help us understand this moment in American politics. Well, it's sort of like the a movie like John Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln, right? That is a lot about the passions of democracy. Like in that movie, Henry Fonda's Lincoln is like standing up against a mob trying to act. I think might have some useful things for this moment in American politics. Um, a film, a film. I'm trying to think. Now that I'm on the spot, I'm having a hard time thinking of. No. This is. I recently okay. I know for me, one of the things I'm having a hard time with is actually trying to understand the psychology of a guy like Stephen Miller in the Trump administration, right? Like trying to understand the psychology of some of the people involved and kind of the worst of this stuff, of this kind of liberal politics. And so a movie like The Conformist from 1970, an Italian film about a young man who ends up becoming sort of like a party official in Mussolini's Italy, is like, for me, was like very helpful in trying to sort of like get into the mentality of this kind of person. So that could be that could be useful, not directly to like broad things in American politics, but just like in terms of psychology of certain kinds of things. Um, a movie I really like that's just about sort of like politics, maybe not this moment, but just about politics is what's called The Best Man, was 1962, 63, with Cliff Robertson and Henry Fonda again, about a contested nomination convention. I think it's a really great film about just sort of like ordinary politics. And I think a movie that's hard to find these days, but is quite good. And I think it's Otto Preminger's Advice and Consent. Is just a great movie about like legislatures. So all the movies I watched were like made before 1970.
Those are great ones. Thank you. Okay. Um, so I want to ask, so in the wake of the 2016 and 2020 elections, there was talk of, quote unquote, hardening our democracy to threats. And I'm curious, like, what do you think we should be doing to make our democracy more resilient? Like, what have we tried? What do we know works?
My read of kind of like the arc of American history is that like US democracy has become more resilient as it's become more democratic, as it's become more open to more categories of people within the society, and it's become more egalitarian. It's actually become like quite a bit more resilient to attacks on democratic processes, right? In the pre-Civil War era, you had entire states that were basically not even remotely democratic in any way. South Carolina was like essentially this like weird oligarchy. Um, the I don't think it's an accident that to the extent that like the U.S. South saw like meaningful two-party competition and like meaningful democratic participation from the end of the Civil War to like the 1960s. It was like during Reconstruction when there is this historically unprecedented expansion of democratic rights throughout the public. Um, the retrenchment from Reconstruction, the subsequent decades, wasn't just a matter of like racial oppression, but actual like democratic deterioration in the South. There's a great book called Paths Out of Dixie by a scholar named Rob Mickey. That is all it's all about thinking about the Jim Crow South as like an authoritarian state, like subnational authoritarianism, a one-party state where there wasn't really meaningful political competition throughout. And that was a consequence of like the deterioration of democratic rights. There's a reason, right? The civil rights leaders encouraged people involved in the movement to think of themselves as sort of like in dialogue with anti-colonial movements around the world. So in the expansion of democracy in the 60s, like strengthen American democracy. So looking at the present forward and hardening our democracy, I don't think it's a matter. Sometimes people talk about this, and we gotta make sure people have respect for the institutions. I think no, we have to make sure that the institutions are actually inclusive and democratic, right? Like in big ways, in small ways. You know, this is my own personal hobby horse, but like if the U.S. presidential, if the electoral system for presidential selection wasn't this like weird mishmash of counter majoritarian and majoritarian elements, if it were just a purely majoritarian thing, I don't think that. I mean, I don't. Maybe Trump doesn't become president to begin with, but I don't think the January 6th plot works. Like the January 6th plot hinges on the weirdness of our presidential selection process. Um, but just if Americans, there's worry that Americans are becoming less committed to democracy, but that might be because a lot of Americans feel democracy isn't particularly committed to them. Um, and to the extent that we can demonstrate through our institutional arrangements, through the way we go about things, that American democracy works for you and wants your participation as much as you should want to support it. I think that strengthens American democracy. I think that there's trying to look for some new counter majoritarian mechanisms, some supermajority rules, something to harden democracy, like misses the point. No, that it's 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 those mechanisms within the system. It's the kinds of habits those inculcate in people, right? Like if you're accustomed to your vote counting more than someone else's, then maybe when your candidate loses, you begin to think of the entire system as illegitimate in a sense. Like this belongs to me, not them. To the extent that our system inculcates, I think, habits of mind that are not advantageous to like living democratically, we should change the system. So that would be my answer. Like we got to make American democracy like much more democratic than it presently is, which may mean kind of like looking at our constitution and saying, well, what about this works for us to that degree, and what about this does not. This is, as an aside, I used to be like very skeptical of sort of like, multi-partyism. Like, yeah, you don't really need multiple parties because all the all the coalition formation just happens before the election instead of after the election. But I've like come to maybe be persuaded that um a more multi-party system in the US would be like an illustrate it would be sort of like the system being, we understand that people want more than one choice, and we're going to make it viable for that choice, for you to vote for that other choice or those multiple choices, and that to be represented in the legislature. And I think that's like the kind of thing, right? It would demonstrate to the public that, like, you know this is not totally unresponsive to you, and I think there's a real sense that like it's unresponsive.
That's really helpful. So I have a last question for you. Tomorrow in this very room, we are going to be spending the day at the Denver Democracy Summit talking about threats to democracy, both here and around the world. I'm curious, as a journalist, what do you feel is an underreported threat to American democracy? What should people be more focused on? What should we be talking about tomorrow?
Hmm. Um, I don't know if I would categorize this as a threat to democracy. Like, I don't know if that's the frame I would use for it. But I would, conversations about American democracy, our conversation here, it's very much about electoral democracy, about political democracy, which is important. Which the struggle for is its own kind of like monumental thing. It's not something to disregard or treat as an essential. But as I like to observe, you know, you vote maybe twice a year, three times a year if you're in a crazy place. But you vote only a couple times a year. The big elections are on every 2 years or so. Um, if you are engaged in sort of like local politics, maybe you sit on a commission, maybe you're on a city council. It's a very small number of people. And in the scheme of your life, of the time you spend, not that much time. You spend a lot of time at your job, and you spend a lot of time in an environment where you most Americans have no real input or say. Like your boss, like your job is I mean the language the political philosopher Elizabeth Anderson uses is your job is a private government owned by a private entity, and it's an authoritarian one. You have no say. You I was just reading something about how some employers don't want their employees to wear headphones anymore, right? You can't wear headphones on the job while you're working at your cubicle. We don't want that. And if you do it, you might get fired, right? That's like authoritarian. And so I think we should think more about what does it actually mean to live in a democratic society beyond political democracy? Like what does that include? Is that do our workplaces, I mean, this is like unionization, right? Do our workplaces need to be more democratic? Do our schools need to be more democratic? Like, what does it actually mean um, to think about democracy not simply as a political system? And I mentioned in our thing earlier this afternoon with students that I read maybe a little too much John Dewey in college, so it's like colonized my brain. And so I'm going to use a Deweyan phrase. What does it mean to make democracy a way of life beyond just voting in an election every couple years? And to the extent that we want a democratic society and one that is resistant to authoritarian threats, how much is extending democratic practice throughout the society, through other places where we exist and live? How much is that a part of strengthening even political democracy? Um, there's sort of a reason, right, that like after the great democratic revolutions of the 18th century and the early 19th century, very quickly people began arguing over like the social question about like the extent of democracy in the society, because the two things are linked. That like political democracy is weaker in places where democracy isn't part of the broader society. Um, and I think that's something that Americans should maybe think a little more about.
This has been an honor. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll all join me in thanking Jamelle
Thank
Bouie.
you.
And thank you all for being here tonight. It's been great. Take care.